In 1975, one of America's most brutal serial killers confessed his crimes to a psychiatrist. But because of doctor-patient confidentiality laws and the victim's own secrets, he was allowed to walk free. And today, he is still alive, living freely in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is the infuriating, unsolved case of the Doodler. It's late at night in a smoky, neon-lit diner. In a corner booth, a quiet man sits alone, sketching on a cocktail napkin. He locks eyes with a stranger across the room. A few minutes later, he walks over and slides the napkin across the table. It's a portrait. The stranger is instantly flattered and completely disarmed. The artist smiles. They leave the diner together, heading toward the pitch-black dunes of Ocean Beach. But the artist didn't come to the beach for romance. Once they are swallowed by the dark, the knife is drawn. The man who walked into the fog expecting a secret rendezvous will never walk out. This trap was just the opening act for one of the most prolific and somehow unknown serial killers in American history. They called him the Doodler. At 1:25 a.m. on January 27, 1974, a calm voice of an anonymous caller echoed through the San Francisco Police Department dispatch. I believe there might be a dead person on the beach across from Alua Street. If you follow the street right down to the water. I was walking along there and I thought I saw somebody lying there, but I didn't want to get too close to him because you never know what could happen, okay? The dispatcher asked for a name, but the caller abruptly hung up. When responding officers arrived, lying face up at the water's edge was the fully clothed body of a man. Fingerprints soon identified him as 49-year-old Gerald Earl Cavanagh. The evidence showed that he was butchered. Cavanagh had been stabbed 16 times. The wounds were distributed chaotically across the front and back of his body. It suggested a personal rage-fueled attack rather than a robbery gone wrong. Yet, Cavanagh had not gone quietly. His hands and arms had defensive wounds, proving he was conscious during the assault and had fought desperately to fend off the knife-wielding assailant. The brutality of the crime showed that the killer was fueled by a targeted fury. The anonymous 911 caller never came forward, leaving investigators to wonder if the voice on the tape belonged to a bystander or the killer himself, admiring his finished work from a safe distance. For 5 months, the SFPD filed Kavanagh's death away as another tragic, unsolved statistic in a city growing increasingly violent. Then, the summer of 1974 brought the killer back out from the shadows, striking at the very heart of San Francisco's queer entertainment community. On the morning of June 25, 1974, a woman walking her dog near the edges of Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park stumbled upon the body of 27-year-old Joseph Stevens. Stevens was a well-known figure in the community, working as a comedian and a female impersonator at the Cabaret Club in North Beach. He had been seen alive the previous night, leaving the club before midnight. Stevens' death was similar to Cavanaugh's. He'd been stabbed 5 times with 3 thrusts penetrating directly into his heart and lungs. Investigators noted that Stevens' car was found parked near the lake, suggesting he had willingly driven his killer to the secluded spot, unaware of the monster sitting in his passenger seat. The coroner determined that Stevens had died shortly before his body was discovered. A local resident later reported hearing a man screaming for help a little before midnight, a desperate cry that went unanswered in the park. Less than 2 weeks later, the killer's rage intensified. On July 7, 1974, another dog discovered a body near Ocean Beach, close to where Kavanaugh had been slaughtered. This time, the victim was 31-year-old Klaus Christman, a German-American immigrant. Unlike Kavanaugh and Stevens, Christman was married and had children waiting for him at home. However, he appeared to have been living a dangerous double life. It was heavily suggested that Christman was a closeted gay man secretly exploring the city's underground scene. He had last been seen alive at a gay bar called Bojangles. The Doodler's radar for vulnerability had locked onto Christman, and the resulting murder was the most savage yet. Christman suffered significantly more stab wounds than the previous victims, and the killer had repeatedly slashed his throat, nearly decapitating him. The level of cruelty that suggested a deep-seated internalized hatred. San Francisco in 1974 and 1975 was a city under siege by extreme violence. The overall homicide rate was more than double what it is today, with 129 murders in 1974 and 132 in 1975. The SFPD homicide division was stretched to its absolute breaking point. The Zodiac Killer, although dormant at the time, still cast a shadow over the area, and the city was completely consumed by the terror of the Zebra murders, a horrific string of racially motivated execution-style shootings carried out by a breakaway faction of the Nation of Islam calling themselves the Death Angels. The Zebra killers left at least 14 people dead on the streets of San Francisco. Against this backdrop of high-profile carnage, the murder of gay men in remote cruising spots barely registered for people. The Castro District was emerging as a sanctuary for the LGBTQ+ community, but systemic homophobia remained deeply entrenched in the fabric of American society. For a man living in the 1970s, being outed meant risking the destruction of his life, the loss of employment, housing, family, and physical safety. The Doodler weaponized this marginalization. He targeted men who were living double lives, men whose disappearances might be ignored or swept under the rug by families too ashamed to ask questions. By sketching them, he offered them something rare, the feeling of being seen and valued. The killer understood that the very society that condemned his victims would act as his alibi. The victims were isolated by their secrets, making them the perfect prey. But his ego was growing, and he was about to make some decisions that would expose him to the light. By the summer of 1975, the Doodler had grown brazen. He began hunting his prey in the heart of the city, bringing his blade indoors. In July 1975, two separate attacks occurred within 2 weeks of each other at the Fox Plaza apartment complex on Market Street. The killer had used his cocktail sketch ploy to gain entry into the private residences of two highly prominent individuals. Both men lived on the exact same floor of the high-rise building, though they didn't know each other. One of the victims was a European diplomat. The killer charmed his way into the diplomat's apartment, engaging in conversation before asking to use the restroom. When the young, lanky artist emerged, the facade had vanished, and he had a knife in his hand. "You guys are all alike," the Doodler would sneer. He then lunged, stabbing the diplomat 6 times in the back. Miraculously, the diplomat survived the attack and managed to escape the apartment, bleeding heavily. Days later, the killer returned to the exact same floor of the Fox Plaza, talking his way into the apartment of a second man, described in police files as a nationally known entertainer. The killer bound the entertainer, preparing to execute him while repeating his mantra about gay men being all alike. However, the victim's screams alerted the neighbors. As the residents began pounding on the walls, the Doodler panicked and fled into the night, leaving his victim physically injured, but still alive. A third survivor, whose identity is completely unknown, also managed to escape an encounter during this period, skipping town and refusing any further contact with law enforcement. The SFPD finally had surviving witnesses. They had men who had seen the killer's face, heard his voice, and experienced his cruelty firsthand. When investigators approached the diplomat and the entertainer, both men refused to testify in open court. To take the stand meant publicly outing themselves, inviting professional ruin, public scandal, and the destruction of their curated lives. For a foreign diplomat, it meant a career-ending recall. For an entertainer, it meant the death of a public persona. The killer had calculated perfectly. He knew that the stigma of homosexuality in 1975 was more terrifying to these men than the knife that had nearly ended their lives. Shielded by the silence of his victims, the Doodler walked out of the Fox Plaza and returned to the streets, his bloodlust unchecked and his confidence surging. The near misses at Fox Plaza didn't deter him. They forced him to adapt. He returned to the desolate parks and beaches, but the violence grew more erratic. On April 27, 1975, a hiker walking through the coastal brush of Land's End discovered the battered body of 52-year-old Warren Andrews. Andrews was a lawyer for the U.S. Postal Service in San Bruno, and he had been brutally beaten and left in a pool of his own blood. In a change from the killer's standing operated procedure, there were no stab wounds. Andrews had been beaten with a rock and a heavy tree branch found near the scene. Andrews survived the initial trauma but remained in a deep coma. He would ultimately die due to his catastrophic head injuries 7 weeks later. Investigators theorized that the Doodler had forgotten his knife that night and was driven by an overwhelming compulsion to kill, so he resorted to weapons of opportunity to fulfill these urges. Weeks later, on May 12, 1975, the killer returned with his blade. The body of 32-year-old Frederick Capen was found on the sand of Ocean Beach. Captain was a Washington native and a decorated United States Navy veteran who had earned medals during the Vietnam War. Despite his military training, Capin was overtaken by the predator after a night out at the Bojangles Gay Club. He was stabbed repeatedly, with the fatal strike tearing through his aorta. The final confirmed victim of the Doodler's reign of terror was discovered on June 4, 1975, hidden deep within an igloo-like cove of brush near the 16th hole of the Lincoln Park golf course. Harold Goldberg, who was a 66-year-old Swedish-American sailor, had been dead for at least 2 weeks before his heavily decomposed body was found. 6 men were dead, 3 had barely escaped with their lives, and the SFPD could no longer ignore the undeniable pattern of a serial killer stalking the city's gay community. The hunt needed a new breed of detective, someone who could navigate the politics of a deeply fractured city. More than a year after the death of Gerald Cavanagh, the SFPD finally assigned a team to hunt the Doodler. The case was handed to inspectors Rotea, Gilford, and Earl Sanders. By November 1975, Gilford and Sanders compiled eyewitness accounts from the Fox Plaza survivors and released a composite forensic sketch to the public via the San Francisco Chronicle and the gay publication The Sentinel. It was of an African-American male, aged 19 to 25, with a slender, lanky build, a medium complexion, smooth skin, wearing a navy watch cap, standing roughly 5'11". The sketch was distributed to street cops across the city, and the tips began to flood the switchboards. Then, a break materialized in one of the most unlikely sources, which would create an ethical and legal problem for the investigation. a call came in from the office of an East Bay psychiatrist. The doctor, identified in the police files as Dr. Howard Peace, reported that a patient undergoing treatment at his clinic closely matched the composite sketch and the psychological profile of the killer. Dr. Peace practiced psychiatry at Highland Hospital, and he was involved in the practice of conversion therapy, attempting to fix the sexual orientation of young gay men. The doctor and his secretary said that this specific patient had confessed to the violence during a psychiatric session, wrestling with severe murderous internal conflicts regarding his own sexuality and lashing out at the men who represented his own hidden desires. Gilford and Sanders moved. In July 1976, the SFPD detained the young men identified by Dr. Peace, and how they caught them was strange. When he was arrested, he was carrying a book of sketches and a long butcher knife tucked into his clothing. As he sat and was interrogated, the suspect was what you would expect of a predator. He was quiet, articulate, and cooperative with detectives, yet he refused to confess to the murders of the 6 men. The investigators felt that they had their man. The physical description matched the survivors' accounts. The psychiatric confession aligned perfectly with the internal rage driving the knife. The suspect had both the artistic ability to draw the portraits and the weaponry required for the crimes. But knowing a man is a killer and proving it in a courtroom are two different things. The district attorney needed sworn testimony to secure a murder indictment, and Gilford and Sanders pleaded with the European diplomat and the nationally known entertainer to take the stand, promising them absolute police protection. But the survivors refused. The threat of what would happen to their professional and social lives was simply too great to bear. And Dr. Priest's testimony was locked behind doctor-patient confidentiality, making the confession useless to the prosecution. The investigation was paralyzed by the silence of the survivors and legal protocol, so the SFP had no choice. Gilford and Sanders watched as the man they firmly believed to be the Doodler stood up, collected his sketchbook, and walked out of the precinct, fading back into the streets of San Francisco. For 4 decades, the Doodler case languished in the archives, overshadowed by the Zodiac and the Zebra killings, leaving the sketch of the quiet artist to gather dust in a cold case box. But in 2018, the landscape of cold case investigations experienced a shift. The arrest of the Golden State Killer via genetic genealogy proved that no predator could outrun the evolution of modern DNA technology. Inspired by this breakthrough, the SFPD reactivated the Doodler case, placing it in the capable hands of veteran cold case investigator Inspector Dan Cunningham. Cunningham approached the case with modern science. He got the preserved blood and DNA samples from 2 of the original 1970s crime scenes and submitted them to advanced forensic labs, searching for a definitive genetic profile that could connect the dots. The SFPD would find out that the primary suspect interviewed by Gilford and Sanders in 1976 was still alive, still residing in the San Francisco Bay Area, and would then remain the absolute focal point of the investigation. Cunningham tracked the aging man down and conducted a new interview in 2018. Obtaining a fresh DNA sample to compare against the historical crime scene evidence. To turn the pressure up on the killer who had enjoyed 50 years of freedom, the SFPD released the 911 audio from the Kavanaugh murder and an age-progressed forensic sketch in 2019, showing what the lanky 20-something artist would look like as a man in his late 60s or early 70s. Somewhere in the East Bay, an old man lives with the memories of the drawings on cocktail napkins and the blood on his hands. Please stay spooky.